Robespierre. He created the terror, and the terror killed him by the guillotine. The air in Paris during the summer of 1794 did not move. It was thick, heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, open sewers, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. In the Place de la Révolution, the great machine stood waiting. It was a construction of wood and steel, simple in its geometry, yet it had become the most significant inhabitant of the city. It did not speak, yet its silence was louder than the screams of the thousands who had gathered to watch it work. To the man sitting in the back of the tumbril, his jaw shattered and bound by a dirty white cloth, the machine was no longer an instrument of justice. It was an inevitability. He had spent his life chasing a ghost called virtue, and now that ghost had led him to the foot of the blade. This was the man who had once argued passionately against the death penalty, a man who believed that a single human life was sacred. Now, he was the primary architect of a system that viewed human lives as mere arithmetic. Maximilien Robespierre was not born a monster. He was born a scholarship student in the provincial town of Arras, a boy who lost his mother early and was abandoned by a father who could not bear the weight of grief. This void was filled by books. He didn't find solace in the company of others, but in the cold crystalline logic of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed with a fervor that bordered on the religious that society was a corrupting force, and that only through a return to natural virtue could humanity be saved. In his early years as a lawyer, he was known for his meticulousness, his sobriety, and his refusal to accept bribes. He lived in a small rented room, ate simple meals, and wore the same powdered wig and olive green coat until they were threadbare. He was the incorruptible. In a world of gambling, drinking, and political maneuvering, a man who wants nothing for himself is the most dangerous man in the room. He cannot be bought, he cannot be seduced, and he cannot be reasoned with once he decides he is holding the hand of Providence. The France he inhabited was a pressure cooker. For centuries, the Bourbon kings had ruled with the assumption that their power was woven into the stars. But beneath the gold leaf of Versailles, the foundation was rotting. The harvest of 1788 had been a disaster. Hailstones the size of fists had destroyed the wheat, and by the winter of 1789, a loaf of bread cost a week's wages for a laborer. People were not just angry, they were starving. Anger is a political force, but hunger is an existential one. When the stomach is empty, the social contract is shredded. Robespierre watched from the sidelines as the Estates General was called, a desperate attempt by King Louis XVI to fix a broken tax system. He saw the wealthy elite and the clergy struggle to maintain their grip, while the commoners, the Third Estate, realized for the first time that they were the heartbeat of the nation. Robespierre was a small man with a thin, reedy voice. When he first stood to speak in the National Assembly, the giants of the era laughed at him. He was too formal, too academic, too obsessed with the abstract notion of the people. But he didn't care about their laughter. He wasn't speaking to the politicians in the room. He was speaking to the millions outside the windows who were digging through trash for scraps of food. He told them what they wanted to hear, that their suffering was not an act of God, but an act of theft by those above them. He spoke of a world where every man was equal, where the law was a shield for the weak, and where the corrupt would finally be held to account. He didn't offer bread. He offered something more intoxicating, moral superiority. He gave the mob a reason for their misery and a target for their rage. The transition from a reformer to a revolutionary happened in slow motion, marked by the sound of boots on cobblestones and the smell of smoke. On July 14th, 1789, the Bastille fell. It was a fortress that held only 7 prisoners, but it represented the physical body of the old regime. When the governor's head was carried through the streets on a pike, the world shifted. Violence was no longer a crime. It was a political tool. Robespierre watched this from the Jacobin Club, a political society that met in an old monastery. Here the air was perpetually blue with tobacco smoke and the heat of radicalism. He began to realize that the revolution was not a single event, but a living, breathing creature that needed to be fed. As the king's power evaporated, a vacuum opened in the center of French life. Louis XVI was no longer a divinely appointed ruler. He was a liability. The royal family's botched attempt to flee the country in 1791, known as the Flight to Varennes, was the turning point. It was a betrayal that could not be forgiven. To the people of Paris, it was as if their father had tried to abandon them in the middle of a storm. Robespierre, who had once been a monarchist who wanted a constitution, now saw the king as a symbol of everything that prevented the birth of his virtuous republic. He began to argue that the king must die so that the nation might live. This was the first time he fully embraced the idea that a single death, or many deaths, could be a form of political hygiene. The introduction of the guillotine was framed as an act of mercy. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, a man of the Enlightenment, proposed a machine that would decapitate its victims in a fraction of a second, ensuring a painless transition from life to death. In the Old World, execution was a theatre of cruelty. Nobles were beheaded with swords, while commoners were broken on the wheel or hanged. The guillotine was the great equalizer. It didn't care about your rank, your birth, or your crimes. It was a bureaucratic solution to a messy problem. It was cold, mechanical, and egalitarian. It was the perfect instrument for a man like Robespierre, who preferred the abstract to the physical. He didn't have to see the blood. He only had to sign the papers. The inciting incident that truly set the machinery of the terror in motion was not a single riot, but the realization that the revolution was being surrounded. Foreign armies were massing at the borders, led by kings who feared that the French disease of democracy would spread to their own lands. Inside Paris, paranoia was a contagion. Everyone was a suspect. The baker who hiked his prices was a counter-revolutionary. The neighbor who didn't wear the tricolour cockade was a spy. The priest who refused to swear an oath to the state was an enemy of the people. Robespierre sat at the center of this web, his eyes hidden behind tinted spectacles. He began to believe that the only way to save the Republic from its enemies was to paralyze them with fear. He didn't see himself as a tyrant. In his mind, he was a surgeon. If the body of the nation had a gangrenous limb, that limb had to be removed to save the rest of the patient. He began to craft a philosophy where terror and virtue were two sides of the same coin. Virtue, he argued, is powerless without terror, and terror is aimless without virtue. It was a terrifyingly logical conclusion for a man who believed he was perfectly righteous. If you are doing God's work, or the work of the general will, then any obstacle in your path is not just a person, it is a sin. And sins must be purged. By 1792, the streets of Paris were no longer governed by laws, but by the whim of the sections, the local revolutionary committees. In September, a wave of massacres swept through the prisons. Over 1,000 people, many of them priests and women, were dragged into the courtyards and hacked to death by mobs. Robespierre did not order these massacres, but he did not stop them. He watched. He understood that this raw, unbridled violence was the energy that kept his movement alive. He began to position himself as the only man who could channel this chaos into something useful. He would be the one to give the mob a legal framework for their bloodlust. He would transform the chaotic violence of the street into the cold procedural violence of the state. The king was put on trial in December 1792. It was a farce, a ritual meant to confirm a decision that had already been made in the hearts of the radicals. Robespierre's speech during the trial was a masterpiece of chilling logic. He argued that the king's guilt was not a matter for a jury to decide, but a fact of the revolution's existence. If the king was innocent, then the revolution was a crime. Therefore, the king had to be guilty. On a cold January morning in 1793, the blade of the guillotine fell on the neck of Louis XVI. The executioner held the severed head aloft, and the crowd roared. But in the silence that followed, a new question emerged. If the king could be killed, who was safe? The answer, whispered in the corridors of the Jacobin Club and the narrow alleys of the slums, was no one. The machine had tasted royal blood, and its hunger was only beginning to grow. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who wanted to build a paradise of virtue, had just unlocked the door to a warehouse of ghosts, and he was the only one with the key. The execution of the king did not bring the peace that had been promised. Instead, it opened a door that could never be closed again. When the head of Louis XVI fell into the wicker basket, it wasn't just a man who died. It was the very concept of sacred order. The blood that splashed onto the wooden planks of the scaffold was a signature on a contract that everyone in France had now signed, whether they wanted to or not. They were all complicit now. There was no going back to the old ways, no retreating into the comfort of tradition. But as the echoes of the cheering crowd faded, a cold realization began to settle over Paris. The king was gone, but the hunger remained. The bread lines were longer than ever, the currency was worth less than the paper it was printed on, and the borders of the country were being squeezed by the iron grip of every monarchy in Europe. The Republic was a fragile, bleeding thing, born in a cradle of fire, and the men who had created it were beginning to look at each other with narrowed eyes. In the halls of the National Convention, the air was no longer filled with the grand rhetoric of liberty. It was filled with the sharp, metallic scent of survival. Every deputy knew that the floor beneath their feet was a trap door, and the only way to keep it from opening was to ensure that someone else stepped on it first. This was the environment where Maximilien Robespierre began to truly find his power. He did not seek the spotlight with the booming charisma of a general or the flamboyant wit of a courtier. He sat in the shadows of the Jacobin Club, meticulously sharpening his arguments like a barber sharpens a razor. He understood a fundamental truth about human nature. In times of absolute chaos, people do not want freedom as much as they want certainty. They want someone to tell them who to blame. They want a hand that does not tremble when it points the finger at a traitor. The obstacles facing the young republic were not merely political, they were existential. To the west, the region of the Vendée had erupted into a brutal counter-revolutionary civil war where neighbors slaughtered neighbors in the name of the church and the crown. To the north and east, the professional armies of Prussia and Austria were marching toward Paris, intent on burning the city to the ground to avenge their fallen cousin, the king. Inside the city, the Girondins, the more moderate faction of the revolutionaries, were terrified of the very mob they had helped to unleash. They wanted a republic of laws, of order, and of intellectual debate. They viewed the sans-culottes, the working-class radicals of Paris, as a mindless beast that would eventually devour everything in its path. Robespierre saw things differently. He realized that the mob was not a beast to be tamed, but a weapon to be aimed. He began to position himself as the voice of the voiceless, the only man who truly understood the general will of the people. He started to frame every disagreement as a moral failing. To oppose him was not just to have a different political opinion, it was to be an enemy of virtue itself. This was the moment the revolution shifted from a struggle for rights to a crusade for purity. And in a crusade, there is no room for compromise. There is only the saved and the damned. Inside the mind of the incorruptible, a dangerous transformation was taking place. Robespierre spent his nights in a small wood-paneled room in the house of a cabinet-maker named Maurice Duplay. The room was Spartan, reflecting the man's rejection of all earthly pleasures. There were no mistresses, no fine wines, no secret hoards of gold. There were only books and piles of his own speeches. He would sit by the light of a single candle, his eyes aching behind his spectacles, rewriting his sentences until they were surgically precise. He began to feel a profound sense of isolation, which he mistook for holiness. He believed that he alone possessed the clarity to see the rot that was infecting the Republic. He looked at his colleagues and saw weakness. He saw men who were distracted by their own egos, their own greed, or their own fears. He felt a heavy, suffocating weight on his chest, the weight of a man who believes he is the only one standing between his country and total annihilation. He started to talk to himself, rehearsing the logic of the scaffold. If the people are good, and the revolution is the will of the people, then anyone who hinders the revolution is an enemy of the people. And what does one do with enemies? One does not debate them. One does not try to reform them. One eliminates them. This was not cruelty in his mind. It was a form of love for humanity. To save the many, he had to be willing to sacrifice the few. He convinced himself that his own conscience was the ultimate judge of French reality. He was becoming the very thing he had once hated, a man who believed his will was identical to the law. The turning point arrived in the spring of 1793. The Republic was on the verge of collapse. General Dumouriez, one of the nation's top military leaders, had defected to the enemy. This betrayal sent a shockwave through Paris. If a hero of the revolution could turn traitor, who could be trusted? The National Convention, paralyzed by fear and internal infighting, finally took a desperate step. They created the Committee of Public Safety. It was intended to be a temporary wartime cabinet, a group of 12 men who could act with the speed and decisiveness that a large assembly could not. At first, Robespierre was not its leader, but he quickly became its soul. He realized that to control the committee was to control the pulse of France. Shortly after, he orchestrated the fall of the Girondins. He didn't use soldiers to arrest them. He used the people. He incited the sections of Paris to surround the convention, pointing cannons at the windows, demanding the heads of the moderates. It was a coup d'état carried out in the name of democracy. As the Girondin leaders were dragged away to prison, the last check on radicalism was broken. The path was clear. The committee began to pass a series of decrees that would change the nature of justice forever. The most infamous of these was the law of suspects. It was a masterpiece of legal ambiguity. It defined a suspect not as someone who had committed a specific crime, but as someone who by their conduct, their associations, or their words had shown themselves to be enemies of liberty. It was a net designed to catch anyone. If you were a noble, you were a suspect. If you had served the old regime, you were a suspect. If you had failed to show enough enthusiasm for the revolution, you were a suspect. Even silence was now a form of treason. The burden of proof was shifted. You were no longer innocent until proven guilty. You were guilty until you could prove your civic virtue, a standard that was impossible to define and even harder to meet. The Revolutionary Tribunal was streamlined. Defense lawyers were eventually abolished. Cross-examination was discarded. The only two possible outcomes of a trial were acquittal or death, and the acquittals were becoming increasingly rare. The guillotine, once a novelty, now became a permanent fixture of the Parisian landscape. It was moved to the Place de la Révolution, where it stood like a dark sentinel against the sky. The sound of the heavy blade sliding down its tracks, a sharp metallic hiss followed by a dull thud, became the new rhythm of the city. It was a procedural sound, a bureaucratic sound. It happened at the same time every afternoon. The people began to treat the executions as a form of grim entertainment. Vendors sold programs and snacks. Women sat in the front rows knitting, counting the heads as they fell into the basket. This was the Red Mass of the Republic. The machine was no longer just a tool, it was a teacher. It taught the citizens of France that life was cheap and that the state was absolute. It taught them that their neighbors were their spies and that their own children could be their accusers. Robespierre watched all of this from his office in the Tuileries Palace. He rarely attended the executions himself. He preferred the abstraction of the casualty lists. He was obsessed with the idea of a republic of virtue. But to build this utopia, he felt he first had to clear the ground of all its old impurities. He began to see the terror not as a temporary necessity, but as a fundamental stage of human evolution. He was no longer just a politician, he was a high priest of a new secular religion. He believed that the blood being shed was a form of baptism, washing away the sins of the monarchy and the church. But the more people he killed, the more enemies he created. The more he searched for purity, the more filth he seemed to find. He was trapped in a cycle of his own making. To stop the terror would be to admit it was a mistake, and Robespierre did not make mistakes. He was the incorruptible. And so, the machine had to keep working. The blade had to keep falling. The list of suspects had to keep growing. He did not yet realize that he had built a monster that would eventually lose its appetite for his enemies and develop a taste for his friends. He was standing on the edge of the abyss, convinced that he was flying. He had forgotten that the guillotine does not recognize the neck of a saint any differently than the neck of a sinner. It only recognizes the gravity of the blade. The heavy wheels of the tumbril groaned against the cobblestones, a sound that had become the heartbeat of Paris. On this day, the cargo was different. Georges Danton, the man whose voice had once shook the walls of the assembly, the man who had breathed life into the revolution when it was nothing but a flickering candle, was being driven to his end. He sat upright, his massive frame dwarfing the other prisoners, his face a mask of defiance and redirected rage. As the cart passed the house of Maurice Duplay, Danton stood and bellowed at the closed shutters, screaming that Robespierre would follow him, that the house would be razed, and that the ground would be salted. Inside, behind those shutters, Maximilien Robespierre sat in silence. He did not look out. He did not flinch. He sat with his hands folded, perhaps listening to the fading echo of his oldest friend's voice. In that moment, the revolution severed its own heart. Danton was the flesh, the blood, and the messy roar of human instinct. Robespierre was the bone, the ice, and the cold, unyielding logic of the ideal. By sending Danton to the machine, Robespierre had removed the only thing that kept him anchored to the earth. He was now alone with his ghosts and his virtue, floating in a stratosphere of pure, lethal abstraction. He had reached the point of no return. He had proven that no one was indispensable, no friendship was sacred, and no service to the state could outweigh the slightest hint of moral deviation. The silence in the room after the carts passed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a tomb that was still being dug. The death of Danton did not saturate the thirst of the Republic. It only increased the speed of the blade. The obstacles facing Robespierre were no longer external. The foreign armies had been pushed back, and the internal revolts were being drowned in blood. The new obstacle was the sheer, overwhelming weight of the system he had built. Paranoia is a hungry thing. It requires constant feeding to stay alive. The Committee of Public Safety was no longer a government. It was a factory of death. Robespierre felt the pressure of 1,000 eyes on him every time he walked into the convention. He began to see conspiracy in every shadow. He suspected his colleagues of being too indulgent, or too radical, or simply too human. He became convinced that the only way to secure the revolution was to accelerate the cleansing. This led to the creation of the Law of 22 Prairial. This law was the ultimate expression of bureaucratic horror. It stripped away the last vestiges of a fair trial. There were no more witnesses. There were no more defense lawyers. The jury was instructed to act based on their conscience and their love of the country, rather than evidence. The only possible verdicts were acquittal or death. This was the beginning of the Great Terror. In a period of just 6 weeks, more people were sent to the guillotine in Paris than in the entire previous year. The machine was moved to the outskirts of the city because the residents of the center complained about the smell of the blood and the constant psychological toll of the falling blade. It was a production line of extinction, a cold, procedural erasure of human existence. Deep within the recesses of his mind, Robespierre was beginning to fracture. He was a man who had never known the warmth of a family or the intimacy of a lover. His only relationship was with the people, a massive, faceless entity that he had invented in his own image. But the people were not behaving as they should. They were still hungry. They were still frightened. They were still prone to the vices he so despised. He began to feel a profound sense of betrayal. He had given them everything, his youth, his health, his very soul, and they were still not virtuous enough for the republic he envisioned. His internal monologue became a cycle of sanctimonious despair. He felt like a martyr who had been chosen by a higher power to suffer for the sins of a nation. He began to withdraw from public life, spending weeks at a time locked in his room, claiming he was ill. During these periods of isolation, his thoughts turned toward the divine. He realized that the revolution had stripped away the Catholic Church, but it had left a void in the human spirit that the cold logic of reason could not fill. He decided that he would provide the solution. He would create a new religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. He would be the architect of a faith that worshipped virtue itself. This was not an act of vanity in his mind. It was a desperate attempt to manufacture a soul for a country that was losing its mind. The turning point arrived on a bright, sweltering day in June 1794, during the festival of the Supreme Being. This was intended to be Robespierre's masterpiece, the moment when the terror would finally be justified by the birth of a new moral order. A massive artificial mountain had been built in the center of Paris, and Robespierre, dressed in a sky-blue coat and carrying a bouquet of flowers and wheat, led the procession. He climbed to the top of the mountain alone, standing against the sun like a prophet. For a moment, he believed he had done it. He believed he had transcended politics and become the embodiment of the nation's conscience. But as he looked down at the thousands of faces below him, he didn't see adoration. He saw a mixture of boredom, confusion, and simmering resentment. His colleagues in the convention, standing behind him, were whispering. They saw a man who had gone beyond the bounds of sanity. They saw a man who was no longer a deputy of the people, but a high priest, who might soon decide that they too were not virtuous enough to live. The very event intended to unite France under his vision instead signaled the beginning of his end. The image of Robespierre atop that mountain, silhouetted against the sky, was the image of a man who had climbed so high that he could no longer see the ground. He had lost the ability to speak the language of men, and could only speak the language of gods and executioners. The atmosphere in the National Convention became tectonic. The fear that had once been a tool for Robespierre now became a weapon against him. A man who threatens everyone eventually unites everyone against him. The final mistake was an act of supreme arrogance, born of exhaustion. Robespierre returned to the convention after a long absence and delivered a rambling 2-hour speech. He spoke of a great conspiracy that was still rotting the heart of the government. He claimed to have a list of names, new traitors who were slated for the guillotine, but he refused to read the names. He held the list in his hand, a piece of paper that contained the life or death of every person in that room, and he let it hang there like a curse. This was the moment the tension broke. Every deputy in the hall, from the most radical to the most conservative, looked at their neighbor and realized they were all on that list. If they did not act, they would be dead by morning. The silence that followed his speech was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a predator deciding when to strike. The shadow list was the ultimate expression of his power, but it was also his suicide note. He had finally pushed the logic of the terror to its breaking point. He had made survival dependent on his removal. The machine, which had been his most loyal servant, was already starting to turn its heavy wooden frame toward him. The scent of blood was no longer a distant thing. It was in the room, and for the first time in his life, the incorruptible felt the cold, sharp edge of a fear that he could not reason away. He had built a temple to virtue, but he had paved the floor with the bodies of his friends, and now the walls were starting to close in. The revolution was about to perform its final, most ironic act of purification. The noise in the National Convention was no longer the sound of debate. It was the sound of a storm breaking. On the morning of July 27, 1794, the air was so thick with heat and tension that it felt as though the wood of the benches might spontaneously ignite. Maximilien Robespierre stood at the rostrum, his face pale, his olive-green coat buttoned tight despite the sweltering room. He tried to speak, but for the first time in his life the words would not come. Every time he opened his mouth, a wall of shouting hit him. "Down with the tyrant!" they screamed. The men who had been his silent accomplices for months were now his loudest accusers. They were not acting out of a sudden love for justice. They were acting out of the pure, visceral terror that he had instilled in them. They knew that if he left that room with his power intact, many of them would not live to see the sunset. Robespierre turned to the deputies of the plain, the moderates he had always looked down upon, and pleaded for his life. But one deputy stood and shouted over the din, "The blood of Danton chokes you." The room exploded. The president of the convention rang his bell incessantly, a metallic clanging that signaled the end of an era. By mid-afternoon, the decree was passed. Robespierre, his younger brother Augustin, and his loyal lieutenants Saint-Just and Couthon were declared outlaws. In the eyes of the Republic, they were no longer citizens, they were infections. They were taken to the Luxembourg prison, but the jailers, terrified of the Commune of Paris, refused to admit them. For a few desperate hours, it seemed as though a civil war might erupt in the streets. Robespierre and his allies retreated to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, where the radical heart of Paris still beat. They sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by maps and empty chairs, waiting for a mob that would never come. The people were tired, they were hungry, they were frightened, and they had seen too many heads fall into the basket to care which side won the latest argument. The night at the Hôtel de Ville was a descent into a nightmare of silence and shadows. Outside, the rain began to fall, washing the dust of the city into the gutters. Inside, Robespierre sat at a table, a piece of paper before him. It was a proclamation calling the sections of Paris to arms. He had signed the first 3 letters of his name, R.O.B., and then he had stopped. Whether it was a final moment of legalistic hesitation or a sudden realization of the futility of it all, the pen stayed still. At that moment, the doors were burst open by the soldiers of the convention. Chaos erupted in the small room. His brother threw himself out of a window, landing on the stones below with a sickening crack. Couthon, paralyzed and unable to flee, was pushed down a flight of stairs. In the center of the room, a pistol shot rang out. The bullet shattered Robespierre's jaw, tearing through his cheek and lodging in the wood of the table. He did not die. He fell to the floor, a broken man who could no longer speak the words that had governed France. They found him lying in a pool of his own blood, his eyes wide and vacant. They picked him up like a piece of refuse and carried him to the very building where he had presided over the Committee of Public Safety. They laid him on a wooden table, the very table where he had signed the death warrants of thousands. For 17 hours he lay there, his head propped up by a wooden box, as people drifted in and out to mock him. He could not defend himself. He could not explain his virtue. He could only listen to the sound of his own labored breathing and the distant rhythmic thud of the machine being prepared in the square. The journey to the Place de la Révolution was a slow, agonizing crawl through a sea of human hatred. Robespierre sat in the tumbril, his head wrapped in a filthy, blood-soaked bandage that held his shattered jaw together. The crowd was unlike any that had gathered before. These were the people he claimed to represent, the people he had killed for, and now they were screaming for his blood with a ferocity that surpassed anything he had seen. They pelted the cart with mud and offal. They danced around the horses. They shouted his own words back at him with mocking laughter. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the square. The guillotine stood waiting, its wooden frame stained dark by the work of the previous months. It was a silent witness, a character in the play that had finally outlived its author. The machine did not care that this was the man who had championed its use. To the steel blade, every neck was the same. When it was his turn to climb the steps, the executioners had to carry him. He was a ghost of a man, a physical ruin of an idea. On the scaffold, the executioner, a man who had become a weary professional in the trade of death, reached out and tore the bandage from Robespierre's face. The shattered jaw fell open, and for the first and only time the man who had stayed silent through the arrest, the imprisonment and the mockery, let out a scream of pure animalistic agony. It was a sound that seemed to sum up the entire decade, a scream of broken promises, failed utopias, and the sheer horror of a world where ideology had replaced humanity. The crowd fell silent for a single heartbeat. Then, the blade fell. The hiss of the steel was the final period at the end of a long, bloody sentence. The executioner held the head aloft, but the cheers that followed were different this time. They were not the cheers of a political victory. They were the cheers of a collective sigh of relief. The terror was over, not because the enemies of the state had been defeated, but because the state had finally run out of blood to spill. The machine had consumed its creator, and in doing so it had exposed the hollowness of the entire enterprise. The aftermath of Robespierre's death was a period of frantic forgetting. The men who had stood beside him in the committee, the men who had signed the same warrants and cheered the same executions, suddenly reinvented themselves as the saviors of the nation. They burned the records, they renamed the streets, and they buried the bodies in unmarked pits of quicklime. They blamed everything on the dead man, turning him into a singular monster, so that they could pretend they were merely victims of his charisma. But history is not so easily cleansed. The blood stayed in the soil, and the memory of the terror stayed in the bones of the French people. They had learned a lesson that would haunt the world for centuries, that the path to a supposed paradise is often paved with the bodies of those who weren't pure enough to enter it. The revolution, which had begun with a dream of liberty, had ended in a bureaucratic nightmare of suspicion and slaughter. It proved that when power is detached from empathy, when the abstract people become more important than the living person standing in front of you, the result is always the same: a machine that eventually finds a reason to kill everyone. What would you have done if you were standing in that square in 1794? It is easy to look back from the safety of the present and judge the madness of the past. It is easy to say that you would have stood against the tide, that you would have spoken out when the law of suspects was passed, or that you would have protected your neighbor when the tumbrils came. But the reality of history is that most people do not choose to be heroes or villains. They choose to survive. They keep their heads down. They wear the cockade. They clap when the blade falls, because they are afraid that if they don't, they will be the next ones on the scaffold. Complicity is not usually born of malice. It is born of the quiet, shivering desire to see tomorrow morning. We like to think that we are different, that our modern world is built on firmer ground. But the machine is never truly dismantled. It is only stored away, waiting for a new architect to convince us that virtue requires the sacrifice of our neighbors. The story of Maximilien Robespierre is the story of the danger of a man with a clean conscience and a sharp blade. He believed he was saving the world, and that belief allowed him to commit atrocities that a common criminal could never imagine. He was the architect of his own extinction, because he forgot that power is a fire that eventually consumes the hand that feeds it. He died by the very instrument he had used to purify France, leaving behind a nation that was exhausted, cynical, and ready to trade its hard-won liberty for the stability of a new emperor. The guillotine remained in the square for a long time, a silent reminder that the line between a patriot and a traitor is often nothing more than a change in the political wind. It shows us that ordinary people, fueled by fear and directed by those who claim to have the only path to the truth, are capable of building a hell and calling it a republic. The terror did not end because the people became good. It ended because they ran out of things to burn. And that is the most terrifying lesson of all.